In Romans chapter 1, verse 16, the Apostle Paul says, quote, I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation, for the Jew first and also for the Greek. End quote. And now for a counterpoint from Greg Koukl. Hey there, folks. Bertram the Barely Bearable Atheist here, continuing our series on Greg Koukl's book, Tactics. According to the subtitle on the book, it's supposed to be, quote, a game plan for discussing your Christian convictions, end quote. And yet, so far, he seems to be spending most of his time talking about how not to let other folks know that you even has any Christian convictions. That was his approach in Chapter 5 about how to reverse the burden of proof, and he's continuing that same theme in Chapter 6, which we're going to cover today. The title of the chapter is Two Reliable Rescues, referring to a couple different maneuvers believers can use to get out of having to defend their faith, which I think is a pretty interesting tone for a Christian apologist to take. Greg seems like a pretty smart feller, and he seems to know how arguments is supposed to work, but over and over again I get the impression he's got kind of a defeatist attitude when it comes to this whole enterprise of apologetics, and that's unusual. Most apologists treat the gospel as if it had some kind of magical power to easily lead folks to Jesus just by believers saying the words, but not Greg. He sounds like he's been in the trenches and has seen firsthand what an uphill battle it really is, and maybe he's taken it to heart, at least to some degree. On the other hand, we's only about a third of the way through the book, so maybe his attitude will shift in the later chapters. 6 chapters in, and we's only on his first tactic, so maybe that's why he's still recommending this sneaky under-the-radar approach. Anyways, he's still talking about the Columbo tactic, and he's anticipating some problems. Quote, you might find yourself in 2 specific circumstances in which you are awkwardly on the defensive with the other person in the driver's seat taking you places you did not intend to go and were not prepared to handle. End quote. In other words, you might find yourself in exactly the situation you was trying to put the other person into, and you ain't gonna like it. Now, you might think that this would be a good time for a little bit of introspection and empathy, and maybe asking yourself, if this is how I feel about being on the receiving end, should I really be using this tactic on folks I'm trying to reach out to? But no, that ain't how Greg sees it. From Greg's perspective, this is all about how the believer can flip things around so the skeptic is the one being driven to places they ain't prepared to handle. And the first of the 2 situations he mentions is what he calls the professor's ploy. Quote, some professors are on a crusade to crush the confidence of any Christian who wanders into their lecture hall, and they're not afraid to admit it. One student told me that on the first day of class, his professor asked all the Christians to raise their hands. With a sniff, he said, you won't be Christians when I get through with you. End quote. Apparently, Greg thinks the God's Not Dead movie is a documentary, or at least he'd like his readers to think so. And worse, he kind of implies that there's even more college professors who's on a secret crusade to crush Christianity without being so open about it. But is that really the case? And did this story really happen the way Greg says the unnamed student says that the unnamed professor at the unnamed college supposedly behaved? Well, I'm going to press X to doubt. You'd have to be a pretty inexperienced counter-apologist to think that this kind of open frontal assault is going to do anything other than to make believers double down on their faith. Not to mention it's an unethical abuse of the power dynamic here. What's more likely is that believers is going to attend college and is going to encounter new information that's going to get them thinking, as well as new friends who can show them that there's life outside the church. And maybe them factors is going to lead a lot of them to start questioning dogmas that they've been taught their whole life. And since professors is the source of a lot of the new information, I reckon it's only natural for folks like Greg to make them into the scapegoat for how come so many students deconvert. But it ain't the professor's fault that the student's faith left them unprepared to deal with the real world. And it ain't really the student's fault neither. That's just a weakness in the Christian faith. Greg's solution to this hypothetical confrontation is for the Christian student to fly under the radar using the Columbo tactic to ask some variation of the questions, what do you mean by that, and how did you come to that conclusion? In a college setting with a professor who knows their subjects, these is good questions that may teach the student more than they necessarily want to know. But as we've seen before, Greg's questions don't fly as far below the radar as he'd like to think they do. College professors has seen internet trolls before, and they knows all about the "I'm just asking questions" gambit, and it don't take long for the Columbo tactic to expose the student's hidden agenda. Quote, the professor might suspect you's a Christian, carefully sandbagging to gain an advantage by maneuvering with questions to make a point, which would be true. End quote. And I'll give Greg just a teeny bit of credit for being open and honest about the kind of bad faith interactions he's advocating here. He don't want students going to class to learn. He wants them in class to prevent other students from learning. He wants them sandbagging and trying to undermine the professor's curriculum. And if the professor calls them out, Greg wants them to dishonestly deflect any discussion of their own views and set themselves up for more sandbagging. Quote, when you find yourself facing any form of the "you prove me wrong" challenge, politely shift the burden back where it belongs, on the person who made the claim. Well, Professor, you might say, you don't know my view since I haven't offered it. For all you know, I'm on your side. Your ideas are on the table here, not mine. All I'm doing is asking for clarification. End quote. In other words, follow in the footsteps of internet trolls and do some harassment. Pretend you've got no agenda even though you do, and claim that you's just asking questions. Behave as though you's ashamed of the gospel, and get yourself off the hook so you can go on about doing everything you can to sabotage the educational process. Now, suppose we's the college professor in this case. How do we deal with a malicious troublemaker like that in a public classroom? Well, first of all, don't be that guy. That is, don't be the professor from God's Not Dead on an off-topic crusade to demolish Christianity from behind the podium. Stay on topic, keep your religious beliefs to yourselves, as most college professors actually do, and ask lots of open-ended questions supplemented by reading. And if we's teaching a subject that Christian students object to, like biology, and they decide to pull a Columbo on us, there's a few tactics we can try. We need to understand, first of all, that the student's goal here is to disrupt the teaching process and prevent the professor from teaching their material. Therefore, the most effective counter tactic is to avoid answering the student's questions during class time. For example, just don't call on the student if you know they's trolling. Or say, let's discuss that after class. Another great resource to have is a community discussion board online that students can register for and discuss class material among themselves. Just say, oh, that's a good question. You should post that to the discussion board. And that way, the student can get answers offline from you and from other students without wasting class time on troll stuff. Another tactic, if you're not pressed for time, is to ask, what specifically is unclear to you? Now, that's a tough one for the obstructive student because they's trying to avoid making a positive claim of any kind in order to avoid the burden of proof. But now you've made a perfectly reasonable request that requires them to make a positive claim about what's unclear and why it's unclear to them. Fact of the matter is, it's perfectly clear to them, they just don't like it. And it's going to be hard to sound sincerely confused when they's really just openly opposed. And if they's really annoying, you can always give them a supplemental reading assignment and ask for a written report. It's amazing how effective that one can be in discouraging bad faith questions. And who knows, it might actually teach them something. Just make sure it's relevant to the question the student asks so you can't be accused of harassing them. I said before that it's best not to ask questions designed to put the other person on the spot on account of it's counterproductive and just makes the other person defensive and more likely to double down. But in a classroom setting, that's an exception. When disingenuous believers is using common troll tactics to try and disrupt the curriculum, they've forfeited any right to your respect and consideration, and you's entitled to shut them down. You can still do so politely and respectfully, but do it firmly and with no question of who's in the driver's seat, as Greg likes to say. And it's worth noting that most of Greg's discussion here is little more than a God's Not Dead fantasy for the average Christian college student at a secular university. It's a built-in weakness to Greg's approach because it sets the Christian student's expectations, and then reality ain't going to match, and that's going to be a problem. Kids can still be obstructionists like Greg recommends, but it ain't going to be as successful as they'd hoped, and that's going to be puzzling. On to the next section entitled Getting Out of the Hot Seat. Quote, sometimes you'll be in persuasion mode in a conversation only to discover that you're facing an aggressive challenger you are not equipped to handle. Maybe the other person knows more about the issue than you do. Maybe you're not quick enough on your feet to keep up with a fast talker in an intense discussion. In any case, you're out of your depth and you know it. End quote. And notice the adversarial tone of Greg's presentation here. This ain't two friends sharing a diverse point of view. This is a contest with two combatants, each trying to put the other in the hot seat, as Greg calls it. It ain't a question of who's right. It ain't a question of who has facts to back up their claims. It's a question of who's winning. And that's important because by focusing on the question of who's winning, the believer's attention is focused away from what the other person's actually saying. After all, we can't have Christians talking to skeptics and being convinced by them, no matter how convincing their evidence or how compelling their arguments. Greg continues, quote, when you feel overmatched and overwhelmed in a conversation, immediately shift from persuasion mode to fact-finding mode. Don't continue to argue your case. Instead, using your first two Columbo questions, become a student of the other person's view by asking for clarification and for reasons. End quote. And for once, I wholeheartedly agree with Greg. This is absolutely the best advice anyone can give a believer who's in the process of discovering that reality ain't what they thought it was. And that's why, in this particular case, I recommend what you might call a pro-tactic instead of a counter-tactic. If a believer is working hard to try and convince us of some point of faith or other, and suddenly backs off and starts asking questions, that's when we should turn down the pressure and give simple, straightforward, non-confrontational answers. This is when my advice not to use gotcha question comes to the fore in a big way. We's at a very sensitive moment, and this is our chance, not just to demonstrate that all our ducks is in a row, but also that we ain't horrible, hateful, evil sinners. A kind word, a gentle response, and a willingness to give the other person room to think and consider what you said can be more effective than an hour's worth of argumentation and debate. Greg follows this up with another bit of useful advice, which we can follow ourselves if need be. Quote, when all your questions have been answered, end the conversation by saying these magic words. Thanks. Now let me think about it. Maybe we can talk more later. End quote. And along with this, let me add another important piece of advice. Don't tell the other person more than they's asked for. There's a limit to how much information a person can absorb at one time, especially when they's approaching it from a hostile bias. Say less than you know and save some for next time. The less you give away up front, the fewer apologetic talking points you'll have to handle when they come back the next time. This ain't dishonest or deceptive, it's just pacing yourself. Trying to convince someone of too much too soon is going to be counterproductive. And it ain't really their fault, it's just human nature. Take it slow, give the other person room to breathe, and you'll have an easier time later on. Greg, of course, is still stuck in his adversarial mindset, so he sees this as a big win for the believer. Quote, all the pressure is gone since you've already pleaded ignorance. You have no obligation to answer, refute, or reply once you've admitted that you're outgunned and need to give the issue more thought. Now who's in the driver's seat? You are, of course. End quote. And no, Greg is wrong here. The truth is that when the believer gets down off of their high horse and admits that they needs to consider what we's told them, ain't nobody in the driver's seat. We's just two ordinary folks having a friendly conversation instead of a verbal combat. And that's a good thing. That's the way social interactions ought to go. Greg's adversarial approach is antisocial and unhealthy and gives Christians a deservedly bad reputation. His best advice is for Christians to listen to what skeptics has to say and think about it, but he spoils it by trying to make it sound like it's still adversarial somehow. Greg continues with some more advice that's useful to us as well. Quote, Do your homework on your own at your leisure when the pressure is off. Research the issue, maybe even enlisting others in the process, and come back better prepared next time. You might even want to start a notebook. Open a computer file and record the question and its details from your notes. Then begin to craft a response based on your research. Review what you've written. Rehearse your response out loud a few times. End quote. And we can do the same thing. It may sound like a lot of work, but it's gotten a lot easier since the advent of internet search engines. And I guarantee you the skeptical side is going to have better answers. And it's worth pointing out the difference between the two sides here. Believers believe in a God that manifestly does not exist, as the real world continually makes plain, and that causes a whole heap of cognitive dissonance that makes believers uncomfortable. And to get around this cognitive dissonance, they has to convert folks, because that's the only way to validate their mythical beliefs. They's a drive there to make converts that us skeptics don't have, and that's a huge difference. We don't need to convert believers to atheism. All we has to do is give a reasonable account for why we believe as we do, and not let them fast talk us into a lifetime of futility serving a mythical deity. And that's a huge advantage for us. If we just hold firm and don't let ourselves be fooled, we've done all we need to do. But that's hugely frustrating for the believer who's trying to convert us, and might even contribute to them one day questioning and deconstructing their own faith. Greg closes chapter 6 with a tip he calls narrating the debate. It's a trick he uses to try and embarrass folks over how they's responding to his arguments. Quote, take a moment to step outside of the conversation, in a sense, and describe to your friend the turn the discussion has just taken. This will help him and others listening to see how he's gotten off course. End quote. And he gives us a hypothetical example of what this might sound like. Quote, I want you to notice the turn our talk just took. First, you made a fairly controversial statement, and I asked you a couple questions about it. So far, you haven't answered them. Instead, you've taken off in another direction. Before we move on to a new topic, would it be okay with you if we finish the old one? I really am interested in your response. End quote. Seriously, Greg, could you be just a bit more patronizing, please? Oh, you can't? My bad. This, of course, is more of Greg trying to put himself in the driver's seat. And if he keeps pulling stunts like this on his friends, I reckon they ain't gonna stay friends too much longer. But worse than that, it's far too easy for this kind of tactic to become manipulative and disingenuous, as Greg demonstrates in another example. Quote, did you notice what just happened? I raised a question about the legitimacy of your idea that all religions lead to God, and you responded by calling me a name, a bigot, to be precise. You changed the subject. We were talking about an issue, and then you attacked my character. Why did you do that? End quote. He don't give us the other person's side of the conversation, so we can't really know if another person really called Greg a bigot, or if he just said that prejudice against other religions was bigotry, or something else. And to be fair, if another person is legitimately trying to change the subject and using actual ad hominem arguments fallaciously, it ain't wrong to call that out. But the danger is that it's easy to cherry pick the other person's words and reframe them into a narrative to make the other person look bad. It's one thing to stop and give an accurate summary of the conversation thus far, but it's quite a different thing to cherry pick words and reframe them into a false narrative. And Greg don't discuss that at all. So this tip is kind of mixed. Used correctly, it's okay, but it's easily abused, and it ain't nearly as cordial as Greg claims it is. If we use this tactic, we's calling the other person out, and they's gonna know it. So use this one with care. And the counter tactic here is actually the same as the tactic. If another person cherry picks words and reframes them into false narrative, then we need to give a more accurate narrative, and then refuse to get into an argument about which narrative is more correct. Go back to whatever the original point was and insist on staying on topic. Don't let yourself be trolled. And that's chapter 6. Some good advice, some bad advice, and a whole heaping helping of fantasizing and Christian persecution complex with a big scoop of anti-education bias thrown in for extra flavor. And remarkably, the emphasis in this chapter has been on how to avoid sharing your faith at all costs. Greg made a passing reference to being in persuasion mode, so I presume we's finally going to get to the actual witnessing stuff in a later chapter. But so far, it's all about preventing other folks from finding out what you believe. And I'm sure there's more that could be said, but that's going to about do it for me for today. Next time, we're going to open up Chapter 7 entitled Columbo Step 3, Using Questions to Make a Point. I ain't looked at it yet, but I'm guessing this is where Greg is truly going to bring out his inner troll. Should be interesting. Meanwhile, thanks for watching, and please be kind wherever possible.